A wildlife researcher managed to film Bigfoot for 5 days straight, but then he suddenly vanished. When he thought he captured the most convincing Bigfoot proof in history, he was not yet aware that he would never make it home. And the way that Bigfoot made this man disappear is the darkest thing that we know he has ever done. Samuel McKenna was 37 years old, and if you had asked him whether Bigfoot was real, he probably would have smiled and started talking about bears, bad lighting, and wishful thinking. He was a field researcher specializing in large mammal ecology who'd spent years studying wildlife in some of the most remote forests in North America, and he had a reputation for explaining away the unexplained. Sam left for what he expected would be a routine 5-day research expedition. He'd done trips like this plenty of times before, hiking deep into the forest to document wildlife that most people never got to see. The tracks started less than a mile from camp. Sam noticed them while following what he thought was a game trail, and right away they bothered him. Not because they were huge, although they were, but because they didn't look like anything he was used to seeing. They weren't hoof prints or paw prints, and they definitely weren't from a bear. Each one looked almost human. His first instinct wasn't Bigfoot. It was that somebody else had wandered into the area barefoot, which would have been strange enough on its own. But the deeper he looked, the less that made sense. The stride was too long, the impressions were far too deep, and whatever left them had moved through thick brush that would have slowed down just about anything else. Most people would have turned around. Sam followed them, and before long, he realized they weren't the only tracks in those woods anymore. The deeper Sam followed the tracks, the more he felt like he wasn't alone. At first, he brushed it off. Forests are noisy places, trees creak, branches fall, and animals move through the underbrush. After years of working in the field, he knew better than to jump at every sound. But this was different. Every so often, he'd hear a heavy footstep somewhere behind him, and the moment he stopped to listen, it would stop too. A few minutes later, a branch would snap from another direction. He'd turn, wait, and find nothing. It happened often enough that even Sam started paying attention because whatever was out there seemed determined to stay just out of sight. He made it back to camp before sunset, but one thing stayed with him for the rest of the day. That night, he found out he wasn't imagining it. By the time the sun went down, Sam had convinced himself the strange feeling would pass. He cooked dinner, organized the day's photos, and recorded his usual video log. He even joked that if those footprints ended up belonging to the world's most athletic bear, he was never going to hear the end of it from his friends. Sometime after midnight, he woke up to the sound of something moving outside his tent. At first it was slow, almost careful, like heavy footsteps trying not to make any noise. A few moments later, the footsteps came back from a different direction. For the next 20 minutes, whatever was outside circled the campsite without ever coming into view. Every so often, a branch cracked under an incredible amount of weight, then the forest would go silent again. Sam never unzipped the tent, and honestly, I probably wouldn't have either. When morning came, he stepped outside expecting to find tracks from a bear or an elk. Instead, the same enormous footprints from the day before circled the campsite just beyond the trees. Whatever had walked around his camp that night was still out there. The question was, would Sam find it first, or would it find him? The next morning, he didn't waste any time. After taking a few more photos of the footprints around camp, he packed his gear, grabbed the camera, and started following the trail again. Whatever had been outside the tent had left a path that was surprisingly easy to follow, almost like it hadn't cared whether anyone found it. About an hour later, the trail opened into a small clearing. That's where he saw it. Standing between two trees was a massive figure, covered in dark brown hair. It was easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung unusually low at its sides. It wasn't crouching or hiding. It was standing completely still, facing in his direction. Instead of running, he did exactly what you'd expect a researcher to do. He raised the camera. The recording lasted only a few seconds before the creature calmly stepped behind a thick pine tree. He kept filming, fully expecting it to come out the other side, but it never did. By the time he reached the tree, the creature was gone. There was nowhere it could have disappeared to that quickly, and the only thing left behind were the same enormous footprints pressed deep into the forest floor. Later that afternoon, while recording his daily video log, he looked into the camera, let out a quiet laugh, and said, "Well, I guess Bigfoot's real." Honestly, I don't think even he realized that was only the beginning. From that point on, the trip wasn't about proving Bigfoot existed anymore. He'd already done that for himself. What he wanted now was to understand what he had just seen. The strange part was how easy it was to find again. Later that afternoon, he spotted it a second time, this time moving slowly along a ridgeline about 200 yards away. It never ran. It never looked startled. If anything, it seemed completely comfortable with the fact that someone was watching. He still thought he was the one observing Bigfoot. He had no idea it was starting to let him get closer. The more footage Sam reviewed, the less Bigfoot made sense. Every large animal he'd ever studied had one thing in common. The moment they realized a person was nearby, they either ran, hid, or became defensive. Bears didn't stand around waiting to be filmed. Wolves certainly didn't. They avoided people whenever they could. Bigfoot did neither of those things. That afternoon, he found it again, feeding along the edge of a clearing. Instead of disappearing when it noticed him, it simply looked up for a few seconds before going back to what it was doing. It wasn't frightened, curious, or defensive. That's what really caught his attention. In one of his notes that evening, he wrote that Bigfoot didn't seem comfortable around people. It seemed familiar with them. There's a big difference between those two things. During his video log that night, he laughed and said, "I've spent years trying to get bears to ignore me. Turns out the only thing that doesn't care that I'm here is Bigfoot." Leave it to Sam to crack a joke after spending the day filming Bigfoot. I don't think he realized he had just described the most unsettling part of the entire story. Bigfoot wasn't acting like an animal that had just discovered a human. It was acting like a human was nothing new. Later that afternoon, Sam decided to try something he'd never normally do. Instead of waiting for Bigfoot to cross his path again, he quietly settled into a spot overlooking the clearing where he'd seen it earlier and waited. Nearly 2 hours passed before a movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from the trees, paused, and looked straight toward the ridge where he was sitting. A few seconds later, it started walking in his direction. Sam stayed where he was with the camera rolling as the distance slowly closed to about 100 yards. Even from there, it was obvious how enormous the creature really was. Then it stopped. It simply stood there, watching him for nearly a minute before turning and disappearing into the trees without the slightest effort to hide itself. That night's recording was noticeably shorter. He still sounded excited, but something had changed. It no longer felt like he was choosing these encounters. The way he saw it, Bigfoot was deciding how close it was willing to let him get. Looking back, I think that's exactly what was happening. The following morning started quietly. Sam headed back toward the same area expecting another glimpse, but the forest felt different. He walked for nearly 3 hours without finding a single fresh track, and for the first time since arriving, it almost felt like Bigfoot had simply disappeared. Then he found one of his trail cameras. The strange part wasn't where it was how it had been left. The camera was sitting upright on a large flat rock nearly 50 yards from where he'd mounted it the day before. It wasn't damaged. Someone or something had carefully removed it from the tree and left it where he was sure to find it. The last few minutes of footage showed Bigfoot walking straight toward the camera. It stopped just a few feet away, stared into the lens for several long seconds, then reached forward with one enormous hand. Recording ended there. In that evening's video log, he couldn't stop thinking about one question. If Bigfoot understood enough to notice the camera, how much else had it noticed about him? When he recovered the camera, Sam expected the mystery to end there. Instead, it raised another question. The memory card had continued recording for a few seconds after Bigfoot picked up the camera. The image swung wildly through the trees before settling on the trail Sam had been using since he arrived. Bigfoot wasn't looking at the camera anymore. It was looking down the path. That thought stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. He followed the trail again, but after a while, the footprints simply disappeared, ending in the middle of the forest with no tracks leading away. He'd spent years tracking wildlife, but he'd never seen an animal that seemed to understand how to avoid being tracked. The next morning, Bigfoot made sure he didn't have to go looking for it. Waiting just beyond the edge of camp was one of the trail markers he'd planted nearly half a mile away. It had been pulled from the ground and carefully leaned against a tree where he couldn't miss it. There were no fresh footprints leading to or from it. Moving the trail marker was unsettling enough. Knowing something had found it in the first place was even worse. What if he wasn't the one tracking Bigfoot anymore? The trail marker stayed on his mind for the rest of the day, but it wasn't enough to scare him away. If anything, it made him even more determined to figure out what was happening. That afternoon, he returned to the same clearing where he'd filmed Bigfoot the day before. It didn't take long before the familiar figure stepped out from the trees. Just like before, he raised the camera and started recording. This time, Bigfoot didn't stand still. It took a few slow steps in his direction before stopping. Then, without any warning, Bigfoot bent down, picked up a rock about the size of a basketball, and threw it. The rock slammed into a tree no more than 15 feet to Sam's right, sending bark flying across the forest floor. With something that large, missing by 15 feet didn't feel accidental. That evening, he couldn't stop replaying the encounter, trying to decide whether Bigfoot had been trying to scare him or warn him. Either way, the message had been received. The rock stayed on his mind the rest of the day, but by the following morning, something else had taken its place. The knocking started just after sunrise. 3 loud knocks echoed through the trees somewhere off to his left. They weren't close enough to make him jump, but they were deliberate enough to make him stop walking. He waited for a few moments, listening, before convincing himself it was probably just a woodpecker. That seemed a lot more reasonable than any of the other possibilities. About a minute later, 3 more knocks echoed through the forest. This time they came from a completely different direction. He stood there for nearly a minute without moving, trying to figure out what he was hearing. There were no voices, no footsteps, no movement through the brush. Just those slow, deliberate knocks spaced a few seconds apart, followed by silence. He recorded the sound before continuing on, but it stayed with him for the rest of the day. Before turning the camera off that evening, he laughed and said that maybe the forest was trying to teach him Morse code. I'll admit, that one got a laugh out of me too. The problem was, the knocking hadn't stopped. It was getting closer. The knocking followed him for most of the morning. Sometimes it echoed from somewhere ahead of him. Other times it came from farther off to his right. Every time he changed direction, the sound seemed to shift with him, but no matter where he looked, he never caught so much as a glimpse of Bigfoot. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up a fallen branch and struck the nearest tree 3 times, then stood there, waiting. For nearly half a minute, nothing happened, and I can only imagine how ridiculous he must have felt standing in the middle of the forest knocking on a tree. Then 3 knocks came back from somewhere deeper in the woods. He didn't answer a second time. Instead, he switched on the camera and started recording, hoping whatever had made the sound would reveal itself. Nothing ever stepped out of the trees. The only thing the microphone picked up was another series of slow, deliberate knocks echoing through the forest before everything went quiet again. He spent the last few minutes of that day's recording talking through every explanation he could think of. Maybe another person was out there. Maybe there was some natural cause he hadn't considered. But after everything he'd seen over the last few days, even he sounded like he was running out of ordinary answers. The next time the knocking started, it wasn't coming from just one direction. The knocking came back the following afternoon while he was hiking along a narrow ridge. At first it sounded just like the day before. 3 slow knocks somewhere off in the distance. He stopped, listened, and waited for another one. It came almost immediately. The second series of knocks echoed from somewhere behind him. He turned around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Before he could take another step, 3 more knocks rolled through the forest from his left. They weren't loud or frantic. If anything, they sounded deliberate, almost measured, as though something was answering from different parts of the woods. Sam stood there for several minutes, slowly turning in place with the camera rolling. He never caught movement on film, but he did capture the sounds. Listening to the audio later, you can clearly hear the knocks coming from different directions, only seconds apart. He didn't say much before ending the recording that night. The joking had mostly disappeared by then. He simply said he couldn't figure out how one thing could be making those sounds from opposite sides of the forest so quickly. I kept replaying that part of the recording. The more I listened, the less I believed there was only one Bigfoot out there. The rest of the afternoon passed without another sighting, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed. It wasn't any quieter than before. If anything, it was the opposite. Every now and then, he'd catch the sound of a branch bending under something heavy, only for it to stop the moment he looked in that direction. Late in the day, he reached another clearing and decided to stop for a few minutes to swap camera batteries and review some of the footage he'd collected. While he was looking down at the screen, something caught his eye in the corner of the playback. Standing farther back between the trees was another dark figure, almost completely hidden by the shadows. It was only visible for a second or two before the camera shifted away, but when he replayed the clip, it was still there. The strange part was where it had been standing. The first Bigfoot had been in front of him. The second one had been behind it, watching from the tree line without ever stepping into the open. He spent the next several minutes searching the area, but by then, the forest looked completely empty again. Before ending the recording that night, he quietly said something that really stuck with me. "I don't think I've been following just one." And if he was right, that meant he'd been surrounded without even realizing it. He barely covered any ground the next day. Every time he started following a fresh set of tracks, another sound somewhere behind him would make him stop and look back. It felt impossible to focus when he could never tell where anything was anymore. The forest that had seemed so open a few days earlier now felt crowded, even though he still couldn't see anyone. A few minutes later, he caught a dark figure slipping between two trees less than 50 yards away. He took off after it without thinking, camera in one hand and backpack bouncing against his shoulders. By the time he reached the spot where he'd seen it, the figure was gone. All that remained were a fresh set of enormous footprints, and about 30 yards farther ahead, another set was waiting. He followed the new set of footprints for another 20 minutes before something finally clicked. No matter which direction they went, they always seemed to stay just far enough ahead to keep him moving. Every time he thought he was about to catch up, the tracks would veer around another ridge or disappear behind another stand of trees, only to reappear a little farther on. He mentioned something in his notes that really stood out to me. After years of tracking animals, he'd never seen one leave such an easy trail to follow. Most wildlife avoided being found. Whatever he was following almost seemed to be doing the opposite. For the first time, he stopped and seriously considered turning back. Instead, he kept following. He hadn't gone much farther when another movement caught his eye. Bigfoot stepped out from behind a cluster of trees, closer than ever before. There couldn't have been more than 40 feet between them. For several long seconds, they simply stared at each other. Sam slowly lifted the camera and started recording, expecting the creature to slip back into the trees like it always had. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was. You can actually hear his breathing pick up on the recording. After everything he'd seen over the past few days, this was the first time he seemed genuinely unsure of what to do next. Instead of taking another step forward, he slowly began backing away, careful not to turn his back. Bigfoot never came after him. It just stood there, watching until he disappeared into the trees. Looking back, I think that was the first time Sam realized there was a difference between being allowed to get close and being allowed to leave. By the fifth morning, Sam looked exhausted. The excitement that had carried him through the first few days was gone. His voice was quieter, and there were long stretches in the recordings where he simply stared into the trees without saying anything. He mentioned he hadn't slept much the night before. Between the knocking, the footsteps, and the feeling that something was always just outside camp, real sleep had become hard to come by. Even so, he wasn't ready to leave. He packed up his gear, looked over the map one last time, and decided to follow the same trail where he'd had the closest encounter the day before. He said if he could just get one clear explanation for everything that had happened, the trip would be worth it. I think that's the moment he stopped thinking like a researcher. He was chasing answers, and whatever was waiting deeper in that forest seemed more than willing to give him one. He found the trail almost immediately, but this time something felt different. The footprints were easy to follow, almost too easy. Every few hundred yards, another fresh print appeared in the soft ground, just enough to keep him moving without ever letting him catch up. After another 10 minutes, he realized the forest had gone completely silent. There weren't any birds calling overhead or squirrels darting through the brush. Even the constant background noise he'd gotten used to over the past few days had disappeared. After years of working outdoors, Sam knew silence like that usually meant every other animal had already decided it was safer to leave. A branch cracked somewhere ahead. He raised the camera and slowly started walking toward the sound. Before he'd taken more than a few steps, another branch snapped behind him. He turned immediately, expecting to catch something moving between the trees, but there was nothing there except rows of pines stretching in every direction. He kept recording as he moved forward, stopping every few yards to listen. Nothing else made a sound. It wasn't until later, while reviewing the footage at camp, that he noticed a dark figure slipping through the trees off to his right. It only appeared for a second before disappearing again. But one thing became painfully obvious. It hadn't been in front of him. It had been walking alongside him the entire time. That discovery stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. Instead of heading back to camp, he sat down with the map, his notes, and the GPS recordings from the past few days, trying to make sense of where all these encounters had happened. At first, nothing stood out. Then he started drawing lines between each location. The first sighting, The ridgeline, the clearing, the trail camera, the place where the rock had landed. None of them were random. They formed a slow, winding path that led deeper into the forest. He spent the next few minutes staring at the map without saying a word. When he finally spoke, he wondered out loud if he'd been asking the wrong question the entire time. Instead of trying to figure out where Bigfoot was going, maybe he should have been asking where Bigfoot was taking him. He folded the map, packed it away, and kept walking. The next set of footprints was already waiting for him. The footprints led him into a narrow valley he'd never planned on visiting. It wasn't marked on any of his original routes, and judging by how overgrown the trail had become, very few people had walked through it in a long time. The first thing he noticed was the size of the trees. They were older, taller, and packed so tightly together that very little sunlight reached the ground. Even in the middle of the afternoon, the whole valley felt strangely dim. Then he started seeing footprints. Some looked fresh, while others had already begun filling with leaves and pine needles. They crossed over one another in every direction, making it almost impossible to tell which way any one of them had gone. He slowly turned the camera, trying to capture as much of the ground as possible. For the first time since arriving, Sam stopped following the tracks. He'd finally reached the place where they all seemed to lead. He hadn't been in the valley long before movement caught his eye. A dark figure stepped out from behind a massive cedar no more than 30 yards away. Instead of disappearing, it stood there watching while he slowly raised the camera. A few seconds later, another figure moved between the trees farther up the valley, then another. He slowly turned in a circle, but no matter where he pointed the camera, there always seemed to be another shape standing just beyond the tree line. He wasn't looking at a lone Bigfoot anymore. He'd walked into their territory. That was enough. After spending nearly an hour in the valley, Sam made his way back toward camp without stopping to film anything else. The excitement that had brought him into the forest was gone. Whatever answers he'd been looking for, he felt like he'd already found more than he was prepared for. Back at camp, he started packing his gear and mentioned that leaving in the morning was probably the smartest decision he'd made all week. He even laughed that his dogs were going to get a very long walk when he got home because he'd had enough of sleeping in the woods. Then he opened the camera one last time to review the footage from the valley. That's when he noticed one of the figures hadn't been watching from a distance. It had been following him back toward camp. Sam headed back without stopping again, and for the first time since the trip began, he wasn't thinking about finding Bigfoot. He was thinking about getting home. He spent the evening packing most of his gear and making sure everything was ready for an early start the next morning. He even mentioned that 5 days in the woods had been more than enough, and that a hot meal and a real bed were sounding better by the hour. Before calling it a night, he sat down to review the footage from the valley one last time. Every encounter over the past 5 days had happened deeper in the forest than the one before it. Without realizing it, he'd spent the entire expedition walking exactly where Bigfoot wanted him to go. The next morning, Sam broke camp just after sunrise and started hiking toward the trailhead. For the first hour, everything felt almost normal. There weren't any strange sounds, no movement between the trees, and no fresh footprints waiting for him around the next bend. After everything that had happened over the past 5 days, the silence almost felt reassuring. Then he spotted another footprint. It was fresh. A few minutes later, there was another. The tracks weren't leading away from him anymore. They were heading in the same direction he was, appearing every so often along the trail as though something had passed through only moments earlier. He slowed down, scanning the woods on either side of the path, but never saw what had made them. It looked like he wasn't the only one leaving the valley. Sam never made it out that morning. About an hour after leaving camp, the camera captured its closest footage yet. One Bigfoot stepped out from behind a line of trees less than 20 feet away and stood perfectly still, staring at him. And then another Bigfoot emerged farther down the trail. Then another appeared behind him. He slowly turned in a circle, but every direction was the same. One stood ahead of him, another off to his left, another behind him. They weren't surrounding him by accident. They were blocking every way out. The next few minutes were some of the hardest parts of the footage to watch. The camera shook as Sam slowly backed away, never taking his eyes off the tree line. The Bigfoot didn't chase him, but they didn't leave either. Every time he tried to back away, another dark figure would quietly appear farther ahead, forcing him to stop again. He stopped talking completely. The occasional heavy breath was the only reminder that the camera was still recording. Then, without warning, he turned and started running. The footage became almost impossible to follow after that. The camera bounced wildly as Sam pushed through the trees, and every few seconds, another loud crack echoed somewhere behind him. More than once he glanced over his shoulder, but whatever was chasing him never stayed in frame long enough to make out clearly. Then the camera suddenly stopped moving. For a few seconds, all it captured was the forest. A heavy set of footsteps came from somewhere just outside the frame. The camera tilted sharply toward the ground, and that was the last thing it ever recorded. Search teams reached Sam's campsite later that week after he failed to return. His tent was still standing, most of his equipment was exactly where he'd left it, and there was no sign that he'd ever made it back. The only reason anyone knows what happened over those 5 days is because of the backup drive they recovered with his recordings, field notes, and camera footage. The files end exactly where you just saw them. After that, there isn't another recording, another note, or any clue that explains what happened to Samuel McKenna. But one thing is certain: Samuel McKenna spent 5 days filming what he believed was Bigfoot. Then he vanished without a trace.